A rusty key, sliding across a polished mahogany desk, changed absolutely everything. While greedy relatives fought fiercely over millions in prime real estate, one broke nephew walked away with a rotting shack in the woods. He thought it was a cruel joke. He had no idea he was holding the map to $1 billion empire. Oliver Finch sat as the back corner of a sterile, glass-walled conference room in downtown Seattle, listening to the rain violently lash against the windows. At 32, Oliver was drowning. The collapse of his independent architectural firm had left him with crushing debts, over $150,000 owed to aggressive creditors. His suit was 3 years old and fraying at the cuffs. Across the massive oak table sat his cousins, Beatrice and Charles, clad in designer fabrics that silently screamed old money and new arrogance. At the head of the table was David Kensington, senior partner at Kensington, Roth and Associates. Kensington cleared his throat, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses before looking down at the last will and testament of Elias Caldwell. Elias Caldwell was a phantom in the family tree. A fiercely paranoid recluse who had abandoned high society in the late 1980s, he was assumed by most of the family to be a destitute eccentric. But when he passed away of sudden heart failure at 81, the estate evaluation sent shockwaves through the bloodline. Elias had been quietly hoarding blue-chip stocks for decades. He was worth over $40 million. To Beatrice and Charles, Kensington droned in a practiced, emotionless baritone. I leave the entirety of the liquid assets, the mutual funds, and the commercial properties located in King County to be divided equally. Oliver watched Beatrice smirk behind her coffee cup. Charles let out a breath he had been holding, instantly calculating his newfound wealth. And finally, Kensington continued, his eyes flickering toward the back of the room, to my great-nephew Oliver Finch, the only member of this family who never once asked me for a dime. I leave parcel 42. It is a 70-acre wooded lot and its accompanying structures located in the Appalachian foothills near Black Mountain, North Carolina. Kensington slid a heavy, rusted brass key across the table. It stopped inches from Oliver's hands. A cabin, Charles scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. The old man left you a shack in the woods? I suppose it suits your current financial portfolio, Oliver. Oliver ignored the jab. He picked up the key. It was heavy, cold, and entirely unremarkable. He had hoped, foolishly, for a few $1,000s. Enough to keep the bank from foreclosing on his small apartment. Instead, he had inherited a liability. A piece of worthless land thousands of miles away. 2 days later, Oliver's rusted sedan struggled up a steep, unpaved logging road deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The GPS on his phone had lost signal an hour ago. The dense canopy of ancient oaks and towering pines blocked out the afternoon sun, casting the mountain in an eerie, perpetual twilight. When the trees finally broke, Oliver shifted the car into park and stared through the mud-splattered windshield. It wasn't just a shack. It was a monument to decay. The structure was a sprawling, single-story cabin built from heavy timber, but time and neglect had ravaged it. The roof sagged dangerously in the center, missing shingles like knocked-out teeth. The front porch was entirely overgrown with aggressive kudzu vines, and the windows were completely blacked out with years of grime and mold. The air smelled thick with wet earth and rotting wood. "Perfect," Oliver muttered, slamming the car door. He needed to assess the property, take some photos, and immediately list it for sale. Even if he could only get $30,000 for the land, It would be enough to hold off bankruptcy. He hacked his way through the overgrown porch and forced the rusted key into the deadbolt. With a violent shove of his shoulder, the heavy oak door screamed open on seized hinges. The interior was a graveyard of dust and shadows. Furniture was draped in heavy canvas sheets, giving the room the appearance of a crowded morgue. The floorboards groaned ominously under his boots. Cobwebs hung thick as curtains from the exposed rafters. It was a completely ordinary, spectacularly depressing, abandoned home. Oliver had just pulled his phone out to use the flashlight when he heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel outside. He froze. Nobody knew he was here. He hadn't even registered the deed transfer publicly yet. Walking to the filthy front window, Oliver wiped away a circle of grime. A sleek, black luxury SUV had parked aggressively close to his beaten-down sedan. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was entirely out of place in the Appalachian mud, wearing an immaculate charcoal suit, an expensive trench coat, and polished Oxford shoes. Oliver stepped out onto the rotting porch, his guard instantly up. "Can I help you?" The man stopped, flashing a terrifyingly perfect synthetic smile. "Oliver Finch, I presume? It is a pleasure to finally meet you. My name is Gregory Mercer. I represent Apex Meridian Capital out of Chicago." "How do you know my name?" Oliver asked, gripping the railing. "And how did you know I was here?" "My firm keeps a very close eye on property transfers in this specific quadrant of the mountain," Mercer said smoothly, completely ignoring the questions. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a thick, crisp envelope. "I'll cut right to the chase, Mr. Finch. I know your current financial situation. I know about the collapse of your firm. I also know that this property is a horrific financial drain. I am authorized to offer you $250,000 in a cashier's check. Right now. You sign a quit-claim deed, and you walk away entirely debt-free." Oliver stared at the envelope. $250,000. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It was enough to wipe out his debt and restart his entire life. His hand instinctively twitched toward it. But Oliver was an architect. His entire career was built on understanding the structural value of things. Why would a massive Chicago firm fly a sharp-suited fixer out to a mold-infested cabin in the middle of nowhere on the exact day he arrived? Why offer $250,000 for 70 acres of useless, unfarmable, vertical mountain terrain? "The tax assessment on this land is barely $40,000, Oliver said slowly, his eyes locked on Mercer's. "You're overpaying by $200,000. Why?" Mercer's plastic smile faded by a fraction of an inch. "My firm is planning a luxury eco-resort. We need contiguous acreage. Your parcel is the final piece of the puzzle. We are willing to pay a premium for convenience." It was a good lie. It was almost perfect. But Oliver noticed Mercer's eyes violently scanning the cabin behind him, lingering on the foundation, a desperate, hungry look masking his corporate composure. "I need time to think about it," Oliver said, stepping back into the doorway. "Mr. Finch, I highly advise against delaying." Mercer's voice dropped an octave, losing its friendly veneer. "This offer expires at midnight. The mountains are dangerous for people who aren't familiar with them. Accidents happen. Structures collapse." It was a blatant threat. "I'll let you know," Oliver said, and slammed the heavy oak door, throwing the deadbolt. He stood in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked around the rotting living room. Elias Caldwell didn't leave him a worthless cabin. He left him a target. Night fell over the mountain like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The temperature plummeted, and a brutal Appalachian thunderstorm rolled in, rattling the fragile cabin with deafening cracks of thunder and torrential rain. Oliver had managed to build a weak fire in the massive stone hearth using broken chair legs, casting long, dancing shadows across the canvas-draped room. He couldn't stop thinking about Gregory Mercer. Accidents happen. Structures collapse. Oliver paced the length of the main room, a rusted tire iron from his car clutched in his right hand. He had spent the last 3 hours tearing the cabin apart. He had rummaged through the kitchen cabinets, ripped the canvas off the rotting furniture, and pulled books off the molded shelves. He found nothing. No hidden safes, no secret maps, no gold bars. Just the sad remnants of an old man's lonely existence, rusted soup cans, moth-eaten blankets, and endless stacks of obscure history books. "What were you hiding, Elias?" Oliver whispered to the empty room. Thunder shook the cabin so violently that soot rained down from the chimney, extinguishing the small fire and plunging the room into near darkness. Oliver switched on his phone flashlight. As he stepped back from the hearth, his heel caught the edge of a warped floorboard. Crack! The rotting wood gave way instantly. Oliver's leg plunged through the floor up to his knee. He shouted in surprise, dropping the tire iron as he scrambled to pull himself free. Panting, he aimed his flashlight down at the jagged hole in the floor. He expected to see dirt. Instead, the beam of light reflected off something smooth, cold, and decidedly metallic. Oliver dropped to his knees. He grabbed the broken edge of the floorboard and pulled. The wood was so compromised by water damage that it tore away easily in long strips. He kept pulling, ripping up section after section of the living room floor, his hands bleeding from splinters. Beneath the false wooden floor of the cabin was a solid slab of reinforced military-grade concrete. And bolted flush into the center of the concrete was a heavy, circular steel hatch. It looked like the airlock of a submarine. Oliver stared in disbelief. Elias was a recluse, yes, but building a subterranean bunker out of reinforced concrete and blast steel required capital, heavy machinery, and serious engineering. How had he done this without drawing attention? Oliver wiped the dust off the massive steel wheel that served as the hatch's lock. In the center of the wheel was a brass keyhole. His heart leaped. He frantically dug into his pockets, pulling out the rusted brass key David Kensington had given him in Seattle. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped it twice before finally sliding it into the mechanism. It fit perfectly. Oliver turned the key. A heavy, satisfying mechanical clack echoed from deep within the steel. He grabbed the wheel with both hands, bracing his boots against the concrete, and pulled with all his strength. With a horrific screech of metal grinding against metal, the wheel turned. The pressure seal broke with a loud hiss of stale, trapped air, and the heavy hatch swung upward on hydraulic hinges. A metal ladder descended into pitch blackness. Oliver swallowed hard. He shined his phone light down the hole, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. Mustering every ounce of courage he had left, he climbed down. The ladder dropped roughly 20 feet beneath the cabin. When his boots finally hit the solid floor, Oliver swept the flashlight around. The air down here was different, climate-controlled, dry, and oddly pure. He found a massive breaker box on the wall and threw the main switch. Fluorescent lights violently buzzed to life, illuminating the bunker in blinding, clinical white. Oliver gasped, staggering backward until his spine hit the ladder. The room was enormous, easily 3 times the footprint of the cabin above. But it wasn't a doomsday shelter, filled with canned beans and water jugs. It was an archives room, Rows upon rows of industrial steel shelving lined the concrete walls. On the shelves rested dozens of thick, lead-lined lockboxes, each meticulously labeled with alphanumeric codes. In the center of the room sat a massive architect's drafting table, completely covered in topographical maps, geological surveys, and thousands of pages of complex mathematical calculations. Oliver slowly walked toward the drafting table. He looked at the largest map, which was pinned to the center of the board. It was a cross-section of the very mountain he was standing on. But beneath the surface lines, Elias had drawn massive, winding subterranean caverns, highlighting specific veins in bright red ink. Oliver read the chemical notations scrawled furiously in the margins. Li, RH, lithium and rhodium. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. He remembered reading an article months ago. Rhodium was one of the rarest and most valuable precious metals on Earth, trading at over $10,000 an ounce. Lithium was the lifeblood of the modern world, essential for every battery in every electric car and smartphone on the planet. Elias hadn't just bought a useless mountain. He had purchased a piece of land sitting directly on top of the largest undocumented deposit of rare earth metals in North America. The value wasn't in the millions, it was in the billions. "This is why Apex Meridian wants the land," Oliver whispered to himself. The eco-resort was a complete lie. They wanted to strip mine the mountain, but Oliver's eyes drifted from the geological map to a heavy leather-bound journal resting on the edge of the desk. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with Elias's erratic handwriting. October 14th, 1998. The Geological Survey confirms the rhodium deposit. The wealth beneath my feet is staggering, enough to topple global markets. But I cannot let them dig. If they bring the heavy machinery, if they crack the mountain open to get the lithium, they will destroy the lower catacombs. They will find what the director hid here in 1944. The wealth of the earth is nothing compared to the secrets of history. I must protect the vault. The bloodline must protect the vault. Oliver frowned in confusion. What the director hid in 1944? He turned toward the rows of lead-lined lockboxes. He walked over to the nearest shelf, his hands trembling as he unlatched the heavy metal clasps of a box labeled C-Alpha-1. Inside the box were layers of archival acid-free tissue paper. Oliver carefully peeled the paper back. Resting in the center of the box was an ornate, gold filigree cylinder. Oliver carefully lifted it. It was incredibly heavy. He unscrewed the top cap and gently slid out the parchment inside. He unrolled it on the drafting table. It was a letter. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed with immense age. Oliver's eyes scanned the elegant, cursive handwriting, stopping completely dead when he reached the signature at the bottom. A. Lincoln. It was an original, handwritten letter by Abraham Lincoln, detailing private thoughts regarding a political strategy during the Civil War. A piece of paper that, at auction, would command tens of millions of dollars, and it was just one cylinder in one box. There were hundreds of boxes in this room. Elias Caldwell wasn't a hermit. He was the warden of a stolen historical empire. Suddenly, a loud, violent crash echoed from the cabin above, vibrating down through the concrete ceiling. Oliver froze, his blood turning to ice. It was the unmistakable sound of the front door being kicked in. Heavy, aggressive footsteps thudded across the rotting floorboards directly above him. Not one person, at least 3. The beam of high-powered tactical flashlights cut through the hole in the floor above the hatch. "Check the perimeter," A deep, gruff voice barked. "Mercer wants the architect found and dealt with tonight. Make it look like a structural accident." Oliver backed away from the ladder, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was trapped underground with billions of dollars in secrets, and ruthless corporate mercenaries were standing 20 feet above his head. He had to find another way out. He had to survive the night. The heavy thud of boots directly above the steel hatch sent a violent jolt of adrenaline through Oliver's veins. Dust rained down from the concrete ceiling as the men above began tearing up the remaining floorboards. "I've got something here," a muffled voice yelled through the layers of wood and steel. "Looks like a subterranean access point. Get the oxyacetylene torch from the truck." Oliver's eyes darted wildly around the blindingly bright archives room. He had mere minutes before they cut through the locking mechanism. He lunged back toward the drafting table, his hands frantically sweeping over Elias's topographical maps. There had to be a secondary egress. A man as paranoid as Elias Caldwell wouldn't build a bunker with only one way out. His index finger traced the red ink detailing the subterranean caverns. At the back of the archive room, behind the industrial shelving, the blueprint showed a narrow service tunnel leading deeper into the mountain, connecting the bunker to a natural limestone cave system. Oliver sprinted to the back wall, desperately shoving aside a heavy shelf loaded with lead-lined boxes. Behind it, concealed perfectly flush against the poured concrete, was a heavy iron door with a simple rotary latch. He hauled it open, revealing a pitch-black corridor carved directly into the mountain's bedrock. As he stepped into the tunnel, the agonizing screech of metal being cut by a blowtorch echoed from the archive room. Sparks began to shower down the main ladder. Oliver slammed the iron door shut, throwing the heavy deadbolt. He plunged into total darkness, turning on his phone's flashlight. The air in the tunnel was freezing, smelling of ancient dampness and limestone. He ran. The tunnel aggressively sloped downward, winding deep into the belly of the Appalachian foothills. After what felt like a mile of breathless sprinting, the narrow rock walls suddenly opened into a massive cavernous chamber. Oliver stopped, panting heavily, his flashlight beam struggling to illuminate the sheer scale of the room. This wasn't a natural cave. The walls were reinforced with aged timber and riveted steel beams. Scattered across the floor of the cavern were dozens of massive, unmarked wooden crates wrapped in heavy tarpaulins. Oliver slowly approached the nearest crate. The wood was stamped with faded military insignia from the 1940s. He recognized the historical context immediately from his late-night architectural history studies. During the height of World War II, David Finlay, the real-life first director of the National Gallery of Art, had famously hidden the nation's most priceless masterpieces at the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina to protect them from potential bombings. But historical records stated that everything was returned to Washington after the war. Oliver tore the edge of the tarpaulin back and pried open the lid of a smaller crate resting on top. Inside, nestled in layers of degraded velvet and straw, was a painting in an ornate, gilded frame. He shined his light on the canvas. It was a mesmerizing portrait of a young woman, the brush strokes masterfully catching the light. In the bottom right corner, partially obscured by age, was a signature that made Oliver's blood run cold. Johannes Vermeer. Elias hadn't just found a few misplaced letters. He had discovered a forgotten secondary vault, a train car's worth of priceless European antiquities, Renaissance masterpieces, and historical documents that had been diverted into this mine shaft in 1944 and intentionally erased from the manifest to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. The sound of a muffled explosion violently shook the cavern. Oliver stumbled, dropping his flashlight. The mercenaries had blown the iron door. They were in the tunnel. "Find him!" Mercer's voice echoed down the stone corridor, distorted and furious. "Leave the artifacts. Just get the architect." Oliver grabbed his phone and scanned the back of the cavern. There, partially hidden behind a stack of rotting crates, was an old, rusted mine cart track leading upward toward a faint, microscopic sliver of moonlight. An old ventilation and exhaust shaft. He scrambled up the loose rock and gravel, his hands bleeding as he clawed his way up the steep incline. The shaft was suffocatingly narrow. He could hear the men entering the main cavern below, their tactical lights sweeping over the crates. "Mercer, look at this!" one of the men shouted. "I don't care about paintings," Mercer roared. "We are here for the lithium. The mineral rights are worth 10 times whatever is in these boxes. Find Finch." Oliver didn't look back. He dragged himself through the dirt and jagged rocks, his muscles screaming in agony. The sliver of moonlight grew larger until, with a final, desperate heave, he burst through a camouflage grate covered in dead leaves and tumbled out into the freezing Appalachian night. He was high on the ridge, looking down at his great-uncle's cabin. He didn't stop to rest. He plunged into the dense woods, running blindly toward the distant hum of the highway. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, casting a weak, grey light across the facade of the local Black Mountain Police Precinct. Oliver sat in a folding chair, wrapped in a thermal blanket, drinking terrible black coffee. Sitting across from him was Special Agent Richard Sullivan, a stern, silver-haired veteran of the FBI's art crime team, whom Oliver had demanded the local police contact immediately. "You're telling me," Agent Sullivan said slowly, placing his notepad on the desk, "that beneath a dilapidated cabin off Route 9, there is an undocumented lithium deposit, the missing Vermeer from 1944, and a handwritten letter by Abraham Lincoln?" "I'm telling you," Oliver said, his voice raspy but terrifyingly calm, "that Gregory Mercer and Apex Meridian Capital are currently trespassing on my legally inherited property, attempting to destroy a historical site to secure mineral rights. If you don't send federal agents up that mountain right now, the greatest art discovery of the century will be collateral damage." Sullivan stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his radio. The raid was swift and entirely overwhelming. By noon, the mountain was swarming with federal agents, SWAT teams, and heavy tactical vehicles. Mercer and his men were arrested on sight, caught red-handed, attempting to load the historical crates into unmarked vans. The subsequent legal fallout was the most spectacular corporate collapse of the decade. Apex Meridian Capital was heavily investigated by the SEC and the Department of Justice for corporate espionage, extortion, and attempted murder. Mercer flipped on his superiors to avoid a life sentence, completely dismantling the Chicago firm. But for Oliver Finch, the real victory happened in the quiet, mahogany-paneled boardrooms of Washington, D.C. Because Oliver was the sole legal owner of the land, he held the keys to the kingdom. He hired the most ruthless property and antiquities lawyers in the country. Under the Antiquities Act and various federal finder's fee structures, Oliver surrendered the historical artifacts to the Smithsonian and the National Gallery, receiving a massive, federally mandated compensation package for recovering and protecting the lost vault. The payout alone cleared his debts 10 times over. But the true wealth lay in the stone. Oliver refused to let the mountain be strip-mined. Using his background as an architect, he negotiated a landmark, multi-billion-dollar lease agreement with a green energy consortium. They would extract the lithium and rhodium using surgical, low-impact subterranean drilling techniques that preserved the forest above and the historical catacombs below. 6 months later, Oliver sat in a wildly different conference room. This one was in his own newly established architectural firm in Seattle, overlooking the Puget Sound. He wore a perfectly tailored Italian suit. His phone buzzed. It was an email from his cousin, Charles. Oliver. The commercial real estate market in King County just crashed. Beatrice and I are completely underwater on the properties Elias left us. We need a loan. Please. Oliver smiled, locking his phone and placing it face down on the polished marble desk. He thought about the rotting cabin, the heavy brass key, and the old man who had seen the true worth of things. Elias knew the cousins would squander the obvious wealth. He needed someone who knew how to look beneath the surface. Someone who knew how to build from the ground up. He didn't reply to the email. Instead, Oliver picked up a set of blueprints. He was overseeing the complete historical restoration of Elias Caldwell's cabin. He wasn't going to sell it. He was going to live there. He had inherited the dirt. But from the dirt, he had built an empire. Did Oliver's incredible journey from crushing debt to billionaire status leave you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this thrilling tale of hidden historical treasure, corporate greed, and ultimate redemption, please hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a good plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing, real-life inspired dramas and mysteries. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you found a secret bunker under your house?